Welcome to our multi-part video series exploring the roles and representations of women in video games. This project will examine the tropes, plot devices, and patterns most commonly associated with women in gaming from a systemic, big-picture perspective. This series will include critical analysis of many beloved games and characters, but remember that it's both possible, and even necessary, to simultaneously enjoy media while also being critical of its more problematic or pernicious aspects. So, without further ado, let's jump right into The Damsel in Distress. Let's start with the story of a game that no one ever got to play. Back in 1999, game developer Rare was hard at work on a new original title for the Nintendo 64 called Dinosaur Planet. The game was to star a 16-year-old hero named Crystal as one of two playable protagonists. She was tasked with traveling through time, fighting prehistoric monsters with her magical staff, and saving the world. She was strong, she was capable, and she was heroic.
And who might you be, animal girl?
My name is Crystal.
Pretty cool, right? Well, it would have been, except the game never got released. As development on the project neared completion, legendary game designer Shigeru Miyamoto joked about how he thought it should be the third installment in his Star Fox franchise instead. Over the next 2 years, he and Nintendo did just that. They rewrote and redesigned the game and released it as Star Fox Adventures for the GameCube in 2002. In this revamped version, the would-be protagonist Crystal has been transformed into a damsel in distress and spends the vast majority of the game trapped inside a crystal prison, waiting to be rescued by the new hero, Fox McCloud. The in-game action sequences that were originally built for Crystal were converted to feature Fox instead. Crystal is given a skimpier, more sexualized outfit.
Wow, she's beautiful. What am I doing?
And yes, that is cheesy saxophone music playing to make sure it's crystal clear that she is now an object of desire, even while in suspended animation. To add insult to injury, Fox is now using her magical staff to fight his way through the game to save her. The tale of how Crystal went from protagonist of her own epic adventure to the passive victim in someone else's game illustrates how the damsel in distress trope disempowers female characters and robs them of the chance to be heroes in their own right. The term damsel in distress is a translation of the French demoiselle en détresse. Demoiselle simply means young lady, while détresse means roughly anxiety or despair caused by a sense of abandonment, helplessness, or danger. As a trope, the damsel in distress is a plot device in which a female character is placed in a perilous situation from which she cannot escape on her own and must be rescued by a male character, usually providing the core incentive or motivation for the protagonist's quest. In video games, this is most often accomplished via kidnapping, but it can also take the form of petrification or demon possession, for example. Traditionally, the woman in distress is a family member or love interest of the hero. Princesses, wives, girlfriends, and sisters are all commonly used to fill the role. Of course, the damsel in distress predates the invention of video games by several thousand years. The trope can be traced back to ancient Greek mythology with the tale of Perseus. According to the myth, Andromeda is about to be devoured by a sea monster after being chained naked to a rock as human sacrifice. Perseus slays the beast, rescues the princess, and then claims her as his wife. In the Middle Ages, the damsel in distress was a common feature in many medieval songs, legends, and fairy tales. The saving of a defenseless woman was often portrayed as the raison d'être, or reason for existence, in romance tales and poems of the era, involving a knight-errant, the wandering knight adventuring to prove his chivalry, prowess, and virtue. At the turn of the 20th century, victimized young women became the cliché of choice for the nascent American film industry, as it provided an easy and sensational plot device for the silver screen. A famous early example is the 1913 Keystone Cops short Barney Oldfield's Race for a Life, which features the now iconic scene of a woman being tied to the railroad tracks by an evil, mustache-twirling villain. Around the same time, the motif of a giant monkey carrying away a screaming woman began to gain widespread popularity in media of all kinds. Notably, Tarzan's love interest, Jane, is captured by a brutish primate in Edgar Rice Burroughs' 1912 pulp adventure, Tarzan and the Apes. In 1930, Walt Disney used this meme in an early Mickey Mouse cartoon called The Gorilla Mystery. The imagery was even exploited by the US military in this recruitment poster for World War I. But it was in 1933 that two things happened, which 50 years later would set the stage for the damsel in distress trope to become a foundational element in video games as a medium. First, Paramount Pictures introduced their animated series Popeye the Sailor to cinema audiences. The formula for most shorts would involve Popeye rescuing a kidnapped olive oil. Second, in March of that year, RKO Pictures releases its groundbreaking hit film King Kong, in which a giant ape abducts a young woman and is eventually killed while trying to keep possession of her. Fast forward to 1981, when a Japanese company named Nintendo entrusted a young designer named Shigeru Miyamoto with the task of creating a new arcade game for the American market. Originally, the project was conceived of as a game starring Popeye the Sailor. But when Nintendo wasn't able to secure the rights, Miyamoto created his own characters to fill the void, heavily influenced by the movie King Kong. The game's hero Jumpman was tasked with rescuing a damsel named the Lady after she's carried off by a giant ape. In later versions, she's renamed Pauline. Although Donkey Kong is perhaps the most famous early arcade game to feature the damsel in distress, it wasn't the first time Miyamoto employed the trope. 2 years earlier, he had a hand in designing a 1979 arcade game called Sheriff. In it, a vague female-shaped collection of pixels, referred to as the Beauty, must be rescued from a pack of bandits. The hero is then rewarded with a smooch of victory for his bravery in the end. A few years later, Miyamoto recycled his Donkey Kong character designs. Pauline became the template for a new damsel named Princess Toadstool, and Jumpman became a certain very famous plumber Princess Peach is in many ways the quintessential stock character version of the damsel in distress. The ill-fated princess appears in 14 of the core Super Mario Bros. Platformer games, and she's kidnapped in 13 of them. The North American release of Super Mario Bros. 2 in 1988 remains the only game in the core series in which Peach is not kidnapped, and also the only game in which she's a playable character. Though it should be noted, it wasn't originally created to be a Mario game at all. The game was originally released in Japan under a completely different title called Yume Kojo Doki Doki Panic, which roughly translates to Dream Factory Heart-Pounding Panic. Nintendo of America thought that the original Japanese release of Super Mario Bros. 2 was too difficult and too similar to the first game, so they reskinned and redesigned Doki Doki Panic to star Mario and Luigi instead. However, the Japanese game already had 4 playable characters, so the designers opted to include Toad and the Princess to fill the 2 remaining slots, building directly on top of the pre-existing character models. So really, if we're honest, Peach is kinda accidentally playable in this one. Still, she had the awesome ability to float for short distances, which came in really handy, especially in the ice levels. Sadly, Peach has never been a playable character again in the main franchise. Even with newer games that feature 4-player options like the new Super Mario Bros. Wii and Wii U, the princess is still excluded from the action. She's been replaced with another Toad instead, as to allow Nintendo to force her back into the damsel role again and again. Peach does of course appear in many spin-offs such as the Mario Party, Mario Sports, and Mario Kart series, as well as the Super Smash Bros. Nintendo Universe crossover fighting games. However, all of these spin-offs fall well outside of the core Super Mario series of platformers. She is the star of only one adventure, and we'll get to that a little later. One way to think about damsel characters is via what's called the subject-object dichotomy. In the simplest terms, subjects act, and objects are acted upon. The subject is the protagonist, the one who the story is centered on, and the one doing most of the action. In video games, this is almost always the main playable character, and the one from whose perspective most of the story is seen. So the damsel trope typically makes men the subject of narratives, while relegating women to the role of object. This is a form of objectification because as objects, damseled women are being acted upon, most often becoming or reduced to a prize to be won, a treasure to be found, or a goal to be achieved. The brief intro sequence accompanying many classic arcade games tends to reinforce the framing of women as a possession that's been stolen from the protagonist. The hero's fight to retrieve his stolen property then provides the lazy justification for the actual gameplay. At its heart, the damsel trope is not really about women at all. She simply becomes the central object in a competition between men, at least in its traditional incarnations. I've heard it said that in the game of patriarchy, women are not the opposing team, they are the ball. So for example, we can think of the Super Mario franchise as a grand game being played between Mario and Bowser, and Princess Peach's role is essentially that of the ball.
Mario!
The two men are tossing her back and forth over the course of the main series, each trying to keep and take possession of the damsel ball. Even though Nintendo certainly didn't invent the damsel in distress, the popularity of their Save the Princess formula essentially set the standard for the industry. The trope quickly became the go-to motivational hook for developers, as it provided an easy way to tap into adolescent male power fantasies, in order to sell more games to young straight boys and men.
Help me! Help me! Help me! Help me! Help! Please help me, Blake!
Throughout the 80s and 90s, the trope became so prevalent that it would be nearly impossible to mention them all. There were literally hundreds of examples showing up in platformers, side-scrolling beat-em-ups, first-person shooters, and role-playing games alike. Let's take a quick moment to clear up some common misconceptions about this trope. As a plot device, the damsel in distress is often grouped with other separate tropes, including the designated victim, the heroic rescue, and the smooch of victory. However, it's important to remember that these associated conventions are not necessarily a part of the damsel in distress trope itself. So the woman in question may or may not play the victim role for the entire game or series, while our brave hero may or may not be successful in his rescue attempt. All that is really required to fulfill the damsel in distress trope is for a female character to be reduced to a state of helplessness from which she requires rescuing by a typically male hero for the benefit of his story arc. This brings us to the other famous Nintendo princess. In 1986, Shigeru Miyamoto doubled down on his damsel in distress formula with the NES release of The Legend of Zelda. This was the first in what would become one of the most beloved action-adventure game franchises of all time.
The Legend of Zelda continues.
Find the crystals. Rescue the princess.
Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link on Nintendo. Now you're playing with power.
Over the course of more than a dozen games spanning a quarter century, all of the incarnations of Princess Zelda have been kidnapped, cursed, possessed, turned to stone, or otherwise disempowered at some point. Zelda has never been the star in her own adventure, nor been a true playable character in the core series. However, it must be said that not all damsels are created equal, and Zelda is occasionally given a more active or integral role to play than her counterpart in the Mushroom Kingdom. Unlike Peach, Zelda is not completely defined by her role as Ganondorf's perpetual kidnap victim, and in a few later games, she even rides the line between damsel and sidekick. Remember, the damsel in distress's plot device is something that happens to a female character, and not necessarily something a character is from start to finish. Once in a while, she might be given the opportunity to have a slightly more active role in facilitating the hero's quest, typically by opening doors, giving hints, power-ups, and other helpful items. I call this variant on the theme the helpful damsel. Indeed, Zelda is at her best when she takes the form of Sheik in Ocarina of Time and Tetra in The Wind Waker. In Ocarina of Time, Zelda avoids capture for the first 3/4 of the game. Disguised as Sheik, she is a helpful and active participant in the adventure, and she's shown to be more than capable. However, as soon as she transforms back into her more stereotypically feminine form of Princess Zelda, she's captured within 3 minutes. Literally 3 minutes. I timed it. Her rescue then becomes central to the end of Link's quest. Similarly, in The Wind Waker, Tetra is a feisty and impressive young pirate captain. But as soon as she's revealed to be and transformed into her more stereotypically feminine form of Princess Zelda, she's told that she's no longer allowed to accompany Link on the adventure because it's suddenly too dangerous for her. She's ordered to wait in the castle, which she does until she's eventually kidnapped, while waiting obediently in the same spot. It is noteworthy that in the very last stage of the boss battle, she does help Link fight Ganondorf for a few brief minutes, which is a refreshing change. However, the next time Tetra's incarnation appears in 2007's The Phantom Hourglass, she's kidnapped immediately during the intro. Later, she's turned to stone and then kidnapped for a second time. It's disappointing that even with her moments of heroism, Zelda is still damseled. She is removed from the action, pushed aside, and made helpless at least once in every game she appears in. This brings us to one of the core reasons why the trope is so problematic and pernicious for women's representations. The damsel in distress is not just a synonym for weak. Instead, it works by ripping away the power from female characters, even helpful or seemingly capable ones. No matter what we're told about their magical abilities, skills, or strengths, they're still ultimately captured or otherwise incapacitated and then must wait for rescue. Distilled down to its essence, the plot device works by trading the disempowerment of female characters for the empowerment of male characters. Let's compare the damsel to the archetypal hero myth, in which a typically male character may occasionally also be harmed, incapacitated, or briefly imprisoned at some point during their journey. In these situations, the character relies on their intelligence, cunning, and skill to engineer their own escape.
That's better.
Or, just punching a hole in the prison wall works too. The point is, they're ultimately able to gain back their own freedom. In fact, that process of overcoming the ordeal is an important step in the protagonist's transformation into a heroic figure. A damseled woman, on the other hand, is shown as incapable of escaping the predicament on her own, and then must wait for a savior to come and do it for her. In this way, the damsel's ordeal is not her own. Instead, it's framed as a trial for the hero to overcome. Consequently, the trope robs women in peril from the opportunity of being the architects of their own escape, and therefore prevents them from becoming archetypal heroes themselves. Today, many old-school damsel games are being resurrected for modern platforms, services, and mobile devices, as publishers are in a rush to cash in on gaming nostalgia and capitalize on any recognizable characters from years gone by. For example, Sega's 1993 platformer Sonic CD, featuring a damseled Amy Rose, has been enhanced and made available for download on a wide variety of modern platforms. Jordan Mechner's famous Karateka and Prince of Persia games, originally released for the Apple II home computer in the 1980s, have both seen modern HD remakes. And the 1983 animated Laserdisc game Dragon's Lair, with ditzy Princess Daphne, has been ported to just about every system imaginable.
Please save me! The cage is locked with a key. The dragon keeps it around his neck. To slay the dragon, use the magic sword.
Remember Pauline, damsel of the classic Donkey Kong arcade? Well, she's also been revived, first in 1994's Donkey Kong for the Game Boy, and later in the Mario vs. Donkey Kong series for the Nintendo DS. Each game features a rehashing of the old excuse plot, with Pauline being whisked away by the giant ape during the opening credits. The now iconic opening seconds of the 1987 beat-em-up arcade game Double Dragon has Marion being punched in the stomach, thrown over the shoulder of a thug, and carried away. In several versions, her panties are clearly shown to the player while she's being abducted. The game has been remade, re-released, and ported to dozens of systems over the past 25 years, ensuring that Marion will be battered and damseled for each new generation to enjoy. Most recently, Double Dragon Neon in 2012 reintroduced new gamers to this regressive crap yet again, this time in full HD. The pattern of presenting women as fundamentally weak, ineffective, or ultimately incapable has larger ramifications beyond the characters themselves and the specific games they inhabit. We have to remember that these games don't exist in a vacuum. They are an increasingly important and influential part of our larger social and cultural ecosystem. The reality is, this trope is being used in a real-world context where backward sexist attitudes are already rampant. It's a sad fact that a large percentage of the world's population still clings to the deeply sexist belief that women as a group need to be sheltered, protected, and taken care of by men. The belief that women are somehow a naturally weaker gender is a deeply ingrained, socially constructed myth, which of course is completely false, but the notion is reinforced and perpetuated when women are continuously portrayed as frail, fragile, and vulnerable creatures. Just to be clear, I'm not saying that all games that use the damsel in distress as a plot device are automatically sexist or have no value. But it's undeniable that popular culture is a powerful influence in our lives, and the damsel in distress trope as a recurring trend does help to normalize extremely toxic, patronizing, and paternalistic attitudes about women. Now, I grew up on Nintendo. I've been a fan of the Mario and Zelda franchises for most of my life, and they'll always have a special place in my heart, as I'm sure is true for a great number of gamers out there. But it's still important to recognize and think critically about the more problematic aspects, especially considering many of these franchises are as popular as ever, and the characters have become worldwide icons. The good news is that there's nothing stopping developers from evolving their gender representations and making more women heroes in their future games. It'd be great to finally see Zelda, Sheik, and Tetra as the protagonists of their own games. And not just mobile DS games, I'm talking full-on console adventures. Okay, so we've established that the damsel in distress trope is one of the most widely used gendered clichés in the history of video games, and has been core to the popularization and development of gaming as a medium. But what about more modern games? Has anything changed in the past 10 years? Well, stay tuned for part 2, where I'll be looking at more contemporary examples of the damsel in distress trope. We'll look at all the dark and edgy twists and turns and see how the convention has been used and abused right up until today. Then we'll check out some games where developers have tried to flip the script on the damsel. I would like to extend a big thank you to all of my backers on Kickstarter who have continued to support me and helped make this video series a reality.